Hello, this is the Happy Families podcast. Today on the pod, something a little bit different. Recently, I was invited onto the Your Kids Next Read podcast with Alison Tate and Megan Daly for a discussion around how we can get our boys reading more instead of having their heads stuck in screens. As the name suggests, Your Kids Next Read is all about books and reading for children of all ages. Alison Tate is a children's author, writer and speaker. She's written a number of books for kids, including adventure series The Mapmaker Chronicles and Maven and Reeve. Megan Daly is a teacher, librarian, author and children's literacy educator. Megan's been awarded the Australian Teacher Librarian of the Year and the Queensland Teacher Librarian of the Year, as well as authoring the best-selling book Raising Readers. And I was also joined on this episode by children's author Matt Stanton. You would know him, I would imagine, from the Funny Kids books, the Bored series, as well as the books that drive kids crazy. We'll dive into that discussion next. Stay with us. Hello, welcome to the Happy Families podcast, real parenting solutions every single day on Australia's most downloaded parenting podcast. This is Dr. Justin Coulson. Today on the pod, we're replaying an excerpt from the Your Kids Next Read podcast with Alison Tate and Megan Daly, as well as Matt Stanton. I was a guest on the podcast episode discussing how we can get our boys reading and addressing some of the alarming statistics around boys and literacy. We started off by discussing some of those stats and fleshed out just what we need to do as parents to get and keep our boys reading. Hope you enjoyed the discussion and check the show notes for the link to the full episode.
First of all, I think it's important to make it clear that reading has declined across the board. Megan and I talk about kids and reading all the time, and I think the discussion about boys and reading has been going on and flaring up since I had my first son 21 years ago. Would you agree with that, Megan Daly?
Yeah, absolutely. Our longitudinal studies in Australia, UK and the US all demonstrate that overall reading rates have declined, and that it isn't just a boys and reading issue, even though that's often where the conversation does flare up. The debate about boys and reading has been going on for decades. Boys, on average, are more likely than girls to read less frequently, read less widely, and disengage earlier from reading for pleasure. This has been documented in literacy testing results, publishing trends, the media and teacher observations. But it's also important to recognise that not all boys fit into this pattern and not all girls escape it.
And I think, widely reported recent stats from the Australian Bureau of Statistics show that, for Gen Z, so, I guess our 5s and 6s are they at the bottom end of that? Or I'm never quite sure where those lines are. But 10% of boys are participating in reading. 13.2% of girls. So we're not exactly like leaping in bounds there either. But I think what we're seeing this time around and this year, it feels to me like there's an urgency around the data that we haven't seen before. And I'm wondering, is it different now or does it just feel different? Like, Justin, perhaps you could give us some thoughts as to why it feels so much more urgent at present.
Yeah, I'm a data guy. I've got a PhD in psychology, and all I do is look at numbers and then figure out what that means in real life. So we've already covered a fair few of them, but what I'm interested in is picture a farm gate or even the front door of your house. At the hinge point, when the door moves, there's not a lot of movement, but down the road, like the downstream effects, all the way at the other end of the door or the other end of the farm gate, a little movement near the hinge leads to enormous movement down the other end. So you're sharing stats about primary school, but let's extrapolate that. Let's build that out and have a look at the progression into high school. If you have a look at, and I'll only share two quick stats because we really need to talk about practical things more than the numbers. But if you have a look at Year 9 PISA results, okay, PISA is the Program for International Student Assessment. Girls are outpacing the boys by 38 points on reading scores. It puts that is the equivalent. 38 points is meaningless without context. That's the equivalent of one full academic year ahead of the boys. And if we have a look at the 2024 NAPLAN results, 3 and 4 Year 7 girls, that's 73%, well, 75% technically, but 73% is what the results showed, were strong or exceeding expectations in writing. But it was only a smidgen over half of the boys who achieved the same. The biggest concern for me is by Year 9 and 8th boys, about 12% of boys are functionally illiterate. It's not an intelligence issue. This is the downstream effects of boys not reading in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, are that by the time they're big enough to have their own screen, laptop, iPad, device, whatever it is, they don't have any interest in reading at all. And why would they? Because the cheap hit of dopamine that they get from a 12-second TikTok is stimulating in a way that, I mean, it's hollow, it's shallow. It will not give you the same sense of engagement, purpose, meaning, satisfaction. It won't even cover your boredom the same way. But it's doing the job. The neural architecture of our boys has been hijacked, and our girls has been hijacked by the best brains on the planet. And that's where the battle is being won.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a discussion we can't have without bringing up the role of screens and social media in the lives of our kids and our boys today. And Justin, your review of that Netflix series, Adolescence, got huge traction around this. Like, there was so much discussion. But how do we, like, I mean, it's one thing to talk about it. It's one thing to kind of have that sort of like massive uptake of interest around that particular series, et cetera. But how do we encourage them to put that stuff down and pick up a book instead? Like, I find with boys, you got to give them a reason. What reason are we giving them?
So there's this thing called, I mean, everyone's heard of it, but in the 1970s it didn't even exist. This thing called intrinsic motivation. Well, it existed, but it hadn't been studied. And intrinsic motivation means that you do something for the love of it. If we have a look at what drives, a lot of people say, how do I motivate somebody, or how motivated are they? And it's the wrong question. Alfie Kohn, who wrote a book called Punished by Rewards, says, instead of asking how motivated is someone, ask how is someone motivated. And there's these different forms of motivation. So everyone knows external motivation and intrinsic motivation, but there's a bunch of others in the middle. Fundamentally, if we want our kids to have those deeper forms of motivation, we need to put them in environments that are what psychology researchers call need-satisfying environments. So a need-satisfying environment is one where, A, I feel like I have a sense of choice. Or if not choice, like, for example, driving on the left-hand side of the road in Australia, you don't have any choice. But we do it willingly because we do it volitionally. We do it choicefully because we get that it makes sense to drive on the left. It would be chaotic. It would be traumatic if we drove wherever we wanted. So we drive on the left because it makes sense. So that sense of autonomy or choice isn't, I get to have carte blanche and do whatever I want. It's, oh yeah, I see value in this activity. I identify its worth as an activity for me to do, so therefore I choicefully step into it. Reading has to feel choiceful. That's the first key ingredient for a need-satisfying environment. The second thing is that reading, or any activity you want, to have those deeper forms of motivation, it has to feel like it's something that I can be competent in, something that I can be masterful at. And unfortunately, the stats show really clearly that too many of our boys do not feel masterful when they pick up a book. They don't feel competent. They actually feel incapable. It doesn't make any sense. It's not working for them. And the third thing is what we call relatedness, or a sense of mutual and reciprocal, I feel like I belong here. And while in interpersonal context, that's easy. Like you, Alison, and me, and Matt, and Megan, we all get to sit together and feel like we're in this connected conversation. But a book does the same thing. The books that our children pick up, if they are willing to engage in it in a relational way, the book talks to them. The book helps them to feel things. But if they don't feel competent, if they feel like they're being forced, or if they feel like the book isn't speaking to them, they won't read it. Therefore, and I know this is kind of a technical answer, but our job is to help them to feel like they get that it matters and they want to do it because they feel like they can do it at a reasonable level and it speaks to them. My number one solution is find books that they want to read. Like if you've got a kid that loves rugby league, go and buy a Rugby League Weekly. I don't even know if that exists, by the way. I'm making it up.
No, it does. And we talk about it all the time.
Right. Okay,
we
great.
are constantly saying, like, if they want to read about rugby, then let's just go hard down the rugby road for sure.
Yeah, totally.
On the Happy Families podcast today, a discussion about boys and reading taken from the Your Kids Next Read podcast. Back with more right after the break. Stay with us.
So, Matt, I'm just going to come back to you for a minute here with this one because there's a few things I want to unpack here. So there was the first thing I wanted to say was when we talk about choiceness and we talk about relating and stuff, you mentioned that when you do your school visits, you're trying to make it look like you're not trying to turn these kids into bookworms. Is that like, what are you seeing as some of the biggest barriers to reading for boys? Is it that peer pressure thing? Because we went to a literary festival at Longreach last week, and we were talking in the green room afterwards. And one of the authors was saying that he had, he'd asked the group, why does everyone love reading and blah, blah, blah. And a couple of kids had said, it's this, it's that. And this boy put his hand up and he's like, yeah, no, it's for nerds. It's for geeks. So there is that certain sense of boys not seeing themselves as readers. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have a couple of interesting things going on where the role that technology is playing in these kids' lives, and I'm a dad, I'm in my kids' lives, is taking up some of that space, that kind of I go to be alone space. So the space that when I was a kid, it was reading. Reading was I'll go and do something on my bed for a while, I'll fill in space. We've now filled that spot with tech. And so that often means that the idea, especially for a kid who already spends a decent amount of time isolating with a device, to then suggest that they take a book and go and isolate, that's just not appealing at all. And what I'm seeing and thinking a lot about is how kids are looking for connection, and the fact that books and reading need to kind of stay anchored and connected in that space. So that's why I spent a lot of time talking about parents reading to kids and how important that is, because we need to create these positive moments of connection around books that are relational. And then we need to look for opportunities, especially with boys, to connect them. And that's where I think it's around stories. That's why I try to talk about stories often more than books, because we all love stories. Stories are innately human, and we love sharing them. All kids love hearing and sharing stories. So what I'm trying to do in the way that I speak to kids in schools is not say, take this book and go and read it on your own by yourself. I'm trying to say, there are these amazing stories in here. You need to connect in, come and see what you can find.
Okay. So, Justin, I'm interested in your thoughts on the idea of boys not seeing themselves as readers, which is something that has come out in the discourse, that there's this idea that reading, they don't see a role for themselves in the reading culture because they think it's for girls, or it can be, quite female dominated. And I will say right now that I would say 98% of the members of the Your Kids Next Read community are female. There's a lot of women in there trying to encourage reading in kids and things like that. So do you think that's is that a thing? Is that something that boys are taking on board, that there's a lot of women doing this, but it's not for me?
One of the most fascinating findings, as I've looked in the fields of anthropology, sociology, psychology, and philosophy, is a sense of agreement across cultures and through history that masculinity is learned. Masculinity is constructed. In other words, you learn masculinity as a boy by watching the men around you. So how many of the boys in the classes that you guys are talking to, in the grade levels that you guys are talking to, how many of those boys go home and see their dad sitting on the couch with a book in his hand? How many of them are having men model searching through pages, looking for a quote or finding that incredible story that they want to read? How many of these kids, male or female, have got parents? I mean, this is all about getting kids reading, right? How many have parents who sit down and say, hey, let me read to you. I'm going to read to you every night. One thing that really is an obstacle, especially around competence, is some kids they won't get going because a book feels too hard. And yet it's the hard books that grab them. When I was in grade 3, Mrs. Brewster was the librarian at Niagara Park Primary School, and I borrowed The Hobbit, and she pulled out the stamp and she said, this is the day it's back. And I took Tolkien home with me and I started to read, and it was just too hard. I was in grade 3. It was way beyond me. I brought it back. She asked me how I liked it, and I made up a great big story about how much I'd loved it. And she said, which part did you like most? And I came unraveled because I hadn't read it, and I made something up, and I could see it in her eyes. She was like, you deceitful little man. You did not read that at all. She didn't say it. She was very polite, but I didn't read it. And now, if my dad had seen The Hobbit in my school library bag and said, Justin, The Hobbit is such a great book. Would you be okay if I read that to you? There's the relational stuff. I get to look over Dad's shoulder as he's reading, so I'm developing competence. And I'm choicefully bringing him into this environment where I start to, and I just can't imagine how that would have changed my feelings. So what I do with my kids, I have 6 of them, is I find books that are a bit beyond them. And I say to them, I'd love to read this book because I think you're going to love it. Back to your point, for boys to love reading, they've got to see men who love reading. I don't know if there's anything else I can say that's more potent.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed something a little different on the show today. We will link to the full episode of Boys and Reading on the Your Kids Next Read podcast. And a big thank you to Alison Tate and Megan Daly for allowing us to share some of that episode with you. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Mim Hammonds provides research, admin, and additional support. And if you think this podcast is going to be helpful for your family or somebody else's, please share it, because if you click those couple of buttons and share it takes you about 10 or 15 seconds, pass it along. It helps other families to be happier. If you'd like more info and more resources to make your family happier, visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.